everybody.
This conference will now be recorded.
I'm the grants coordinator with Loudoun County, and I thank you all for joining us today. I've worked with many of you over this course of this process in the last 6 months with our mid-cycle reports with many of you, and we're hoping that this webinar will kind of lay the groundwork for the information that we're seeking from you to eliminate much of the back and forth that we had with organizations with a mid-cycle report. So hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions and that this process will be a little bit more smooth. So welcome to CARES Act Fund Round 1 and Round 2 reporting requirements. Just a little bit of an overview. The Board of Supervisors accepted 2 allocations of CARES funding, one on May 19th and the second one on September 1st. Both allocations totaled a little bit over $36 million. In the first allocation, $2.6 million was allocated to nonprofits and faith-based organizations providing services in Loudoun County, while $2.25 million was allocated in Round 2. In addition to that, there was $600,000 specifically allocated to emergency food assistance in Round 1 and $500,000 in Round 2. And in total, with Round 2 and Round 1, we had 78 eligible organizations receive CARES Act fund dollars. Also an overview, the CARES Act stipulates what the funds can be used for and are necessary expenditures incurred due to COVID-19 were not accounted for in your most recently approved budget, which was of March 27th, and expenses that were incurred between March 1st and December 30th, 2020. Also, this talks about how expenditures need to be expended by December 30th, and if an organization has any unexpected, if you don't feel like you can spend all of your CARES Act award by December 30th, we ask that you let the county know, let either Megan and I both know that you may not be able to spend on all your funds. Because we'll need to get those funds back in time for us to be able to send them back to the state. So if indeed you have any sense that you may not spend it down, let us know as soon as possible. Also, part of the condition of receiving funds was we asked you to maintain proper accounting of the records and your expenditures. So now when we come to reporting, we'll be able to get what your expenditures are, and then also have you send in all of the backup invoices or receipts that back up all of your expenditures. And as previously mentioned, all this documentation is due to the county on or before January 4th of 2021. In the application process, in the first round, we had 4 funding categories: food assistance, service expansion. You also were able to apply for food assistance and service expansion together. We had service interruption, and then in the second round of funding, we added a service category for service continuity. And now we come to our reporting requirements. So each organization received a spending plan that was tailored to the funding category in which your organization applied for. So you may have, if you received funds under service interruption, you received a reporting template. An updated one was sent to all organizations on Monday, under which the service category that you applied, and the spending plan follows the budget template of the initial application in which you applied under. So everybody should have received something that looks like this. Now, what we're asking everybody to do for round one applicants, what we're asking you to do for your final report is to update your spending plan. The spending plan that was just recently sent to you, update the spending plan with the dollar amounts and the expenditures that you had through your mid-cycle report. And then update it with your additional expenditures that you had through that second installment of funds. So you'll update your round one spending plan with your mid-cycle information and then continue to update it with those expenditures that you had from either September or September 15th through December 30th. For round two applicants, this is new for you. What we're asking you to do is we have three categories. We have operating proposed, operating revised, and operating spent. What we're asking all applicants to do is in the operating or in the proposed column. So you have several proposed columns. We're asking you to provide us with the information in which you provided in your initial application to us. So you may have proposed $7,000 in operating, $28,000 in salaries, $12,500 in supplies. Your total amount that you asked for, we're using this as an example, was $67,500. Not every applicant, or there were no applicants that received 100% of their request. So what we're asking you to do in your revised column is based on your CARES Act fund award, tell us what your revised budget now looks like. So my initial ask was $67,500. My award was the $57,375. So how did I kind of shift those dollars based on my award amount? So that's what we're looking for in the revised column. And now in the spent columns, how did you spend those funds? And we're only looking for dollars that go against your Loudoun County CARES Act fund dollars. We recognize and realize that many organizations far exceeded what the county funds provided to your organization, but we're only asking you to show us expenses against that award that you received. So in our final reports, our spent column should now equal what that revised column looks like. We're asking you to not change this template in any way. If you've only asked for funds and salaries, we want you to keep the spreadsheet the way it is and only report under salaries. Or it might be one or two categories, but we're asking you to not revise this template at all.
And Barb,
so
we do have one question. We do have one question in that box. If an organization received round one and round two funds, should they combine all expenses into one sheet or keep them separate?
That's a great question. I'm going to pull up an actual, of course I didn't have this. Okay, let me, give me 1 second. So all organizations received in their spending plan, there was a service interruption round one on the left-hand side, and then service interruption round two. We're asking you to submit round one and round two separately. So your round one is going to be on the round one spreadsheet, and then your round two expenses are going to be on the round two expenses spreadsheet. So everybody received that. The only organizations that do not have to complete two of the spreadsheets are those organizations that only receive funds in round one. Then you don't have to do anything with round two. And those organizations that only receive funds in round two, you don't have to do anything with round one. And then the other category that only has to do one reporting template is service continuity, because we didn't have that funding category in round one. So you would only do the round 2 reporting. So moving on, so everybody has, here we go. Everybody has this part. So you complete your proposed, your revised, your spent. And then what we're asking you to do on the second part of the spreadsheet, let me move here. There's a bottom part where we're asking you to split your service categories in expenditure categories that have been defined by the federal government, by the CARES Act. And under these expenditure categories is how the county needs to report to the state and how the state needs to report to the federal government. So we're asking you to put your expenditures within these columns and then within the months. So you'll break down your expenses by month, by expenditure category. Within that month, you're going to have a total amount for that month in that expenditure category. So you may have 5 or 6 Junes if you have expenses within all of these spending categories. So we're at the spending category. Both of these are drop-down menus. You'll do your month total here, and then we're asking you to submit the list of invoices that make up that total amount for the month. So whatever invoices, it might be one invoice that makes up that $1,800. It might be 15 invoices. We're asking you to list all those invoices in the invoice numbers. Let me pull up the list all the invoices here. You'll see here, these are the drop-down columns with all the expenditure categories here. List the total amount for the month in that category, all of your invoice numbers. And then if there's anything that might be a variance to the number, might be something that a reviewer might question, we're just asking you to make any notes or explanations in this column. And I can review that a little bit further in a moment. So this is what the bottom looks like. There's going to be there's going to be a total sum at the bottom of the spreadsheet. This total sum should match your total spent up in here.
And Barb, we do have some questions
Okay.
coming into the chat box. The first is, just to be clear, do we want different spreadsheets for round 1 and round 2, or are they 2 tabs within the same file?
There are 2 tabs within the same file. So I can show you real quick. Let me pull it up. Let's see.
And as Barb is pulling that up, I will also say, here's another question. Can timesheets be listed under invoice numbers if the cost was for salary? The answer is yes, and we will be talking through some of that. Barb does have some examples as we move through a further example of the sheets. The next question is about receipts. What about receipts that don't have invoice numbers? I think we also have a couple of those where we can talk through some options for reporting if numbers are not listed on a receipt.
And so right here is, this is for food assistance. So you'll see here, there's a tab for round 1 food assistance, and then a round 2 food assistance where we're asking for the same information. So we're asking you to split these out. And here you'll get a total of your total award for round 2 will pop up here. And then your total award for both round 1 and round 2 will pop up there once you have them all populated. So the total of your the total of the numbers here for round 2 should equal, and at the bottom of the spreadsheet, there is a total. Let's see if we can get to it. There's a total here. So this number, this cell should equal, at the end of the day, will equal what you spent here for round 2. So they're 2 separate spreadsheets. So I hope that answers that question. So going back to, let me go here. So I'll just show you, here's how we are suggesting organizations label their supporting documentation, their backup information. Label them under the spending categories, and these are the spending categories within the budget. I'll just pull it up here. So these would be operating, salary, supplies, equipment. So I just have a few examples for operating. Labeling in operating, and then June. And then here's the invoice. So we have invoice number, the dollar amount of the invoice, and the date of the invoice. I know there's some organizations that may be doing it by month, and then the category. What we're really looking for is an easy way for reviewers to be able to tie the invoices back to the spending plan. So here we have an invoice of the 1374. So if we go back to this, here we have here the 1374 is the invoice number. It's under operating, and it gives a little description of what it's for. And it's for the total amount. It's for $1,800. So it has a total amount. So it's quick, it's easy to read. If we want to get that further detail, we can open up the invoice, if it'll let me. And we'll be able to see exactly what. So here again, highlighting the invoice number, the date of the invoice, and then the total amount of what that is. We're not asking you to highlight things on the invoice, but we're just asking that those are the things that we're looking for to make sure that everything ties back. Similarly to, I'll do a couple payroll. Here's for salaries. July. Here's where an organization put the salaries into an Excel spreadsheet. They labeled the employees. They did their July. Oh, I'm sorry about that. So Mary's July was 12,000. The percent that went towards CARES Act fund was at 9%. And then this is the dollar amount that I'm looking for in any backup. So using, hang on one second. So using the additional backup that they provided was a payroll stub. We're going slow. So here's a payroll stub for this employee. And we're just highlighting, if I can find it. We're looking for the amount that was on, the spreadsheet that they provided. So it was in July, we have the July, we have the amount, it ties back to that spreadsheet that the organization provided with the details. Another sample for payroll is just from an outside agency that does an organization's payroll. It's a total of what that payroll is. So we have this backup here. We look at it, however, and the amount is greater than what is going against the CARES Act funds. So what's been done in the notation here is that $1,700 is only being applied to CARES Act funds. So this just tells us that you're confirming a part of that, but we want to know what that part is and what that part equals. I'll show you another example. Yep.
We do have quite a few questions in the chat box.
Okay.
And so we will start with the question of the expenditure categories. So the question is, the expenditure categories are different from the categories above in the Excel sheet. How do we reconcile those?
That's a great question. It's a great question, and you can step in at any time. I think some of them are very, so the PPE. Go ahead.
So what we are looking for, Barb, if you can scroll up just a little bit, what we're looking for is your organization to tell us how you've revised your budget. So the table on the top should look somewhat familiar because these are the categories that you proposed in your CARES Act application. So you should have, at least some of these categories where you've proposed funding and have spent funding. So go back to your application and take a look at those revised and proposed amounts for each of those. So that is where you will get the top information. We are looking for it by month. So it will just be generally what you proposed to spend in your application. That's all we are looking for here, is a by month breakdown of what you've proposed, revised, and spent. We did not ask to review your revised spending plans once you received your award amount. So we do need you to just fill in what you revised your spending plan to be. This should equal the amount that you were awarded. We don't want any money back. So I just want to make that clear that the revised and the spent should equal the award amount. And it should be similar. It should have the same categories, just with different spending amounts as your application. Then when we scroll down to the expenditure categories, what we're looking for here is going to help the county to report to the state on how you were spending the funds. So we learned a few weeks ago that there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 16-ish expenditure categories that the federal government is looking for. So of the information that you entered at the top, tell us where each of these was spent, right? So for instance, if you have a revised budget of $850 in November for operating expenses, we would want to see that in administrative expenses for the month of November in the total amount of $850. So then we would need to have some justification, some evidence that $850 was indeed spent. So if it was an invoice, if it was payroll, if it was a Wi-Fi receipt for replacing a Wi-Fi extender, for instance, we would want to have the receipts and then a note that explains what that was for, if there's anything different from the total amount. So for instance, let's say you spent on operating expenses a Wi-Fi extender. It actually was $950. You have the receipt. You've numbered it. If it's just a regular receipt, you can just attach a number to it. Or you can assign a number based on whatever the receipt may be. And Barb is pulling one up now. And essentially what we're looking for is an explanation that you spent $850 of the CARES dollars on this $950 invoice. What we have to do on our end is then reconcile those for your spending. Okay, so essentially what we need you to do is assign these categories to your expenditures. We do not have definitions for those, so we are relying on you to choose the definitions for each of these expenditure categories. All right, so if you are looking at personal protective equipment, that's pretty self-explanatory. Administrative expenses, pretty self-explanatory. If you had direct services or direct payments to residents, you can look for programs like, for instance, food programs or housing support. Those would be your direct payments or your direct contributions to residents. And so what we're looking for there is your background information and your records for each of those expenditures. And the expenditures that you have in your total amount column should match what you have in your columns above. I hope that makes sense, because essentially what we have to do is match what your spent column is above to your expenditure categories below. And we are relying on you to do that and provide evidence for each of those spending categories. Another question is, do we need to submit all invoices or just the ones not previously submitted in the mid-cycle report?
We're asking you to submit all of your invoices. So we have kind of one package. So if you could resubmit those invoices that you submitted with your mid-cycle report, that would be great. You can label them round 1 mid-cycle report invoices, so it's clear to us, and then you can submit your other invoices. However, we would ask that if you did not submit your invoices either by category or by month in the round 1 mid-cycle report, that you categorize and you organize those invoices so the reviewers can easily go back and check things. What we don't want to have is 250 pages worth of invoices that reviewers have to sift through to tie it back to the expenses. So if you can help organize those, if you did it in the first round, that would be appreciated.
All right, the next question is, if I have many invoices in a month/category, how will I tie my explanations to the invoices or receipts they're associated with? We have many invoices that are only partially CARES funded and we'll need to explain that in the notes. Should I repeat the invoice number with the note?
That would be helpful to tie it back. So the invoice number will be here. So if you have that, and then for instance, we have this invoice. I can pull it up real quick. So here we have the invoice number, the amount that's going to CARES Act funds and the date. Hang on. Oh. All right, we're having some technical issues here. Hang on one moment. I'm having a problem opening it. Here we go. So I just blocked out. So invoice number, we played with it. It's in June. Here, the total amount was $109.96. There's a notation here that says only $54.98 went from the CARES Act funds. So that's how we want to. And then as you can see here, we've tied it back to the, we've tied it back. Invoice 4216, only $54.98 by CARES.
All right. The next question is, My organization has contractors and we are under contract to pay the individuals providing the service based on an annual contract. We have no timesheets and the contractor does not invoice us. Just clarifying that there will be no information provided under the category invoice number. Is that okay? So I'll take this one, and I think the short answer is you would probably need to provide us, no, you will need to provide us with at least the pricing information in your contract, so that we are aware that there is a formal written agreement for services rendered, and you would just need to label the contract in a similar way that you would label a receipt so that we have the information should there be an audit. Essentially, what we need to do is make sure that we can appropriately assign the categories and the explanations to a specific service and or individual. So we would need at least the pricing sheet and the name of the contractor so that we have a sense of where those dollars are going and where they've gone. Another question is it okay that we've moved funds from one category to another? For instance, from PPE to rental assistance.
That is okay that you changed. We understand that because all organizations did not receive their funding request, their full funding request, that you needed to kind of shift some funds. And also as we moved further into the pandemic, we also recognize that needs may have changed as well. So I think if you fully explain that, whether it's in your notes, if you get explain to us why you needed to shift those funds from one category to another. That would be helpful for the reviewers. And of course, as long as the expenses are eligible expenses.
Yeah, and I think that's important to point out that the expenses have to be an eligible expense. During our introductory webinars to the CARES Act funding, we did note and have noted throughout that all expenses have to have been unbudgeted as of March 27th and must be COVID related. So for instance, if that contract is not directly related to COVID or does not have a substantially COVID related service, then that would not be an eligible expense. This has to be related to COVID-19 mitigation or response. So I do want to make that clear that that is something that you would have to have a justification for. The next question is, can we include salary bonus to an employee and still put it in the category of salary?
Megan, I'll defer to you on that one.
Oh, sorry, I'm still reading through. So the short answer for any salary bonuses is, again, they have to be tied to COVID-19 related activities. So if it is simply an annual bonus, that would not count as an eligible expense. If it is something like overtime or holiday pay where it's related to COVID-19 mitigation or response, it would need to be included in the category of salary, but a bonus would not be considered an eligible expense. The next question is, we reimbursed people who did purchasing. We have a couple of situations where we have many receipts for expenditures adding up to a single reimbursement to an individual. Should we provide the receipts as well as a copy of the reimbursement check? The short answer is yes. We would need a paper trail of the expenditures and then the reimbursement. So for instance, if an individual used their personal credit card and then was reimbursed by your organization for those purchases, then we would need both the receipts and the reimbursement. So we would need to have that very clear that an individual was purchasing outside of an organizational P card or something like that and was then reimbursed for their activities.
One suggestion and one thing that an organization or several organizations did for the mid-cycle report is they provided a spreadsheet, and they listed the employees' names, the purchases that were made, the dollar amounts, the date of the purchase, and then we were easily able to go back and then see what those purchases were from the receipts. So whether it was a Home Depot receipt, whether it was an Amazon receipt, but the spreadsheet did help us to go back and tie those receipts back to the expenses.
Okay, yeah, great. All right, so one additional question related to moving funds from one category to another. So for instance, the example of from PPE to rental assistance, how do we show that in the reporting?
You can, I would suggest going to, you can make a notation here. You can make a notation, if it up in here, you can say in the month of June, you moved, I think wherever you can easily show it, or you can also, if you moved from salaries to PPE and you have a invoice for that PPE, you can document it on that invoice saying that funds moved from operating to PPE because of this for whatever reason. So I think either in the notes section, you can certainly put it there. And again, on any other backup documentation that may be part of that expenditure.
All right, we have quite a few more questions. So one is related to check numbers. This organization is working on a rental relief program, and they have rent check numbers, but not invoice numbers. So for instance, they've been providing direct relief on behalf of residents. Do you want a list of the check numbers? And if so, can that be a de-identified Excel sheet attached?
The check numbers would be acceptable, and yes, it could be on an Excel spreadsheet.
All right, the next question is, will our federally approved indirect rate suffice for our explanation of indirect costs? So short answer to that is federal indirect rates should not be applied for the CARES Act funding. What they would be applied as administrative expenses. So again, be thinking about this in terms of the expenditure categories, not as an indirect rate. So just be thinking about that these really are administrative expenses for your programming, and we need to make sure that they are categorized in the expenditure categories as noted in the drop-down menu. The next question is, our CARES funding partially covered the cost of one equipment item on one invoice. Do we need to complete the entire spreadsheet with all of the other categories or just equipment?
So if I understand the question correctly, can you say it again, Megan?
Yeah. So our CARES funding partially covered the cost of one equipment item on one invoice. Do we need to complete the entire spreadsheet with all of the other categories or just equipment?
Just the equipment, and then just note on if the invoice was $20,000 and you allocated $5,000 of your CARES Act fund dollars to that, just note that either in the notes explanation column and or on that invoice, just so it's clear that X amount of CARES funds was used to cover this expense.
Yeah. And if it's 100% of your CARES Act funding, let's say you received $5,000 and that $5,000 went to equipment, everything else on your invoice would be blank except the equipment in the month for the top total, and then the expenditure category below for equipment. And that is it. Everything else is blank. And all of that should just be able to be illustrated. The evidence should be able to be provided on that invoice. Next question. Do you want individual files for each receipt or invoice? And if so, that could result in dozens of files which may not fit in one email.
So what organizations did for the mid-cycle report for round 1 is provided, they sent it in a zip file. So when you open the zip file, it was either by month or by category, and then the invoices were in those different folders. So providing a zip folder seemed to work fine for our round 1 mid-cycle reporting.
Mm-hmm. All right, the next question is related back to the reconciliation of categories. The question is, Amy was asking how to tie the more granular categories in the drop-down menus to the overarching categories in the upper spreadsheet. It looks like you want us to key the larger category name in the notes field. Is that the right thing to do? So if I'm understanding this question, essentially what we need you to add in your file is just the expenditures that you had for your application in the upper table. So for instance, the overarching categories are in that upper table, right? So you have operating, salaries, supplies, equipment, etc. Those are the big categories that we asked you to apply for during the application process. This was prior to the Treasury office providing our desk reference guide for reporting. So what we're trying to do is translate those large categories that we asked you to apply for into the now more granular categories of the expenditure categories for the Treasury. So what we would need you to do is translate the larger categories into these more granular expenditure categories. And you can choose which category you think best fits your expense. You don't need to add notes if it is a one-to-one correspondence. So for instance, if it was, as we mentioned, $850 in administrative expenses, and you can tell that it's $850 in operating expenses, all we would need is an invoice number. We don't need any notes or explanation. Where we need the notes and explanation is where there may be some misalignment in the amount you've noted above to the amount you've noted below. So for instance, if you spent $1,050 in November and you only are claiming CARES Act funding for $850, that's where you would make a notation, is if there is some misalignment or some notation where there's going to be something that doesn't reconcile. And if that doesn't make sense, we'll have some time once we stop the recording to kind of go back and forth with some other examples. The next question, I think we may have answered this one, but I want to make sure. For direct service payments on behalf of clients, does a check register or trial balance provide adequate support?
Yes. We had trial balance sheets provided to us in the mid-cycle reporting that were very detailed. We could tie them back to the expenses. So yes, that is sufficient.
Okay. The next question is, would all payroll go to payroll for public health and safety employees?
Under the expenditure categories?
Yes.
So Megan, I don't know how the public health, how that's defined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the guidance for the CARES Act, essentially it would be anyone who is substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 emergency would be approved as an eligible expense for payroll. So you can just go ahead and list it under public health and safety employees. You can also list it as item not listed above if it is not a public health or safety position. So we do have some organizations that have hired individuals or who have reassigned them to specific COVID-19 activities or to monitor those activities. Those would be listed under the payroll for public health and safety employees, whereas some who may be providing tertiary supports or educational supports, social benefit kinds of supports would be under an item not listed above. So for instance, tutors or distance learning experts for whom you've had to contract for services, those might go under items not listed above because they wouldn't necessarily be directly relating to public health and safety. However, they would be still responding to the public health crisis. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the personal question and answer. But essentially what we were looking for is anyone directly related to public health and safety, you would list it under payroll. For those who may have a tertiary or supporting role in technology, instructional design, things like that would go under items not listed. All right, the next is, do you want all individual document files, or do you want us to combine all invoices for round 1 and then all invoices for round 2 in 2 separate PDF files?
If you could separate them in 2 PDF files, that would be easier for the reviewers to have the round 1 and the round 2 in separate files.
Okay. The next question is, do we need to list every single receipt? For example, this organization is working with hotels. Do they need to submit every single hotel receipt, or can they put all hotel receipts into one invoice and PDF it?
We need to see all the documentation associated with an expense. So if you provided hotel assistance in the month of June and you spent $1,800 and it was 18 receipts, we need to see all the backup that goes into that expense for the month.
All right, the next question is, we ordered an item last month, but it might not arrive by December 30th, which means the invoice won't arrive until after December 30th. We have the paperwork that shows it was ordered. Is this expense still eligible?
Yes, the expense is still eligible. You've incurred the expense. As long as we have that backup that shows that the expense has been incurred, the fact that you might receive it past December 30th, it's fine. It is an eligible expense.
All right. The next question again relates to how they reconcile the expenditure categories on the bottom of the spreadsheet with the categories on the top of the spreadsheet. For example, housing support or improving technology expenditures, are they both operations?
So there is housing support here. So you would have to go back to see where in your application process, where you allocated your housing expenses in your housing spreadsheet or in your housing application. So I don't have the housing one up. I can pull one up quickly. But it depends on where you allocated the expense up here. But if it truly is a housing expense, it would go under the housing support.
Right. So essentially, it's going to depend on where you placed it in your application. What we're looking for is for you to go back to your application materials. If you placed housing support checks or direct assistance in operating, or food assistance checks in supplies, it would just need to be located in whatever category you used above. So essentially what you would do is just make sure that your allocations from your application and your revised budget are the same in the table above to what you applied for and actually received. Then it's up to you to then provide the expenditure categories. So regardless of the location of the categories above, you would need to then reconcile those with what the federally required reporting category is. We don't have definitions for those. So again, it'd be up to you to identify the categories based on your best judgment and assign those accordingly. So if you added housing support and improving technology expenditures in operations, it would be fine to include those in operations, and then you would just need to separate them out in the categories below. All right, we have a few more questions. Let's see. We received a PPP loan earlier this year, but the time period has expired. Can we use payroll expenses for the CARES funding that were incurred after the PPP loan time frame? So short answer is this is probably an offline conversation that includes a lot of additional details. So please email us so that we can set up a time to discuss the roles and the payroll activities for your organization. The next question is equipment supposed to go under administrative expense? Again, that depends on where you've placed it. And that's up to your organization where you've placed your categories for the application and where you would like them to be placed for federal reporting.
So it may go under the items not listed above.
Correct. All right, we are moving into some additional questions here. Are grocery gift cards expenses for food expenditures?
Say that again, grocery gift cards, food expenditures?
Eligible
Yes.
expenses for food expenditures. Mhm.
Yes, they are. We just need to make sure that we have the appropriate documentation, meaning getting as much information as we can, which would include the serial number of the card, the date that it was distributed to. If we're not able to get an individual's name, we would like to know who in your organization distributed it, where was it distributed, was it at a shelter, was it at how was it distributed? As much information on those details as possible so we can kind of link those expenditures back to a card. So the reporting information is a bit more detailed. We can send, if you want to follow up, we can send you specifically what we're looking for, but it is quite detailed. But it would be considered a food expense.
All right, and it looks like the last one is just a clarification from Amy. So to recap, the final report is two things: the completed spreadsheet and a file/files of all invoices named for the expenditure listing sent to both Megan and Barbara via email. Can we confirm that?
Correct. Yes, we can confirm that. That's exactly what we're looking for.
And that is all of the questions at this point.
All right. So I'm gonna move. So I just want to reiterate that the reports, the final reports for both round 1 and 2 are due on or before January 4th at 4:00 p.m. If you have any questions after this, feel free to reach out to both Megan and I so we can respond to you. And we'll go from there. And that's it. I think our last one is the questions, and we've got those answered.
All right. And so I do want to remind everyone that this has been recorded, and we can and will provide this recording on the Loudoun County website. I know some individuals have a preference for discussing in person versus over the chat. So what I would like to do now is open up the lines for additional questions, should we have any. So I'm going to stop the recording because sometimes it gets a little messy with the closed captioning. So I'm going to stop the recording now.